So I need to build a structure so that I can hatch more birds on my farm.
Wait a minute. How does a person make birds?
You see, if a person has an incubator, they can take fertilized eggs and they can keep those eggs inside the incubator. And that incubator is gonna act like a mama bird, and it's gonna give those eggs a chance to hatch. And on our farm, last year, the big project was to build this massive timber frame barn. And part of my vision in wanting to build this barn is I wanted to build a place where I could hatch my birds. And even more specifically, this spot right here that's marked off with the tape, this is the spot where I want to build my bird hatchery. Now, I've never done anything like this, but I'm gonna document it and bring you guys along for the ride so that you too can experience the joy and ecstasy of building a hatchery. Now, if you guys aren't familiar with what incubators look like, this is one incubator, this is another incubator. This is actually my big professional incubator. So now if you want to get bird eggs to hatch, you actually have to keep those eggs at a very steady and constant temperature. These incubators do a really good job at keeping that temperature, but the problem is they have to be in a place that's steady and constant temperature too. So usually what I'll do is I'll keep them inside our house, and our house will keep constant at like say 60 degrees, and that's what lets the incubators do their thing. But my beautiful wife, Allison, does not want me hatching birds in the house anymore.
I'd like to give you some tips on what you need to do if you've just been served with divorce papers.
And so in the name of avoiding a divorce, I need to move my hatching operation outside. I've got to figure out a way to keep these incubators at a steady and constant temperature. That's why I need to build this insulated room that's gonna go right here. And you're gonna be there to help me, aren't you? So this is one of my barn cats, it's Ginny Barn Cat. This fella right here, he's the other barn cat on our farm. He's Pablo Barn Cat. Ow, Pablo! We've got a third barn cat here on the farm, but she lives inside the house and her name's Lil Barn Cat. But Ginny and Pablo are gonna be my helpers in this construction project. Are you two fighting? Please, contain the chaos. Sometimes it's hard to tell the difference between cats fighting and playing. Now, designing this hatchery is not all that complicated, but I do think it's good to just take a couple of minutes to like figure out exactly what I want to do. So when I think about what I'm trying to build here, I've got essentially a box that is 8 feet by 12 feet. And somewhere in here, I want to put my door. Probably be a standard size door, maybe slightly smaller than standard, because the height of the box is going to be about 8 feet as well. So if you're looking at like the cube version of it, it kind of looks like this. Once I have this box framed out, I'm then going to go in and put in like a whole bunch of insulation and some ventilation stuff so that like I can have air pass in and out, as well as have a heating system inside of there, because my entire barn is unfinished, meaning it's really just boards up against the wall, and so there's no way to retain heat. This insulated box, it's gonna have, you know, pretty thick walls inside, that's gonna be insulated. That's gonna be how all the heat gets retained. That makes sense, right? I gotta get a little bit more specific. If I'm framing out this 8 by 12 square, I'm gonna need to figure out how to put studs in. This is gonna be like framing out any sort of building or structure that you're doing. Like if you were putting a new room in your house, you'd be doing the exact same thing I'm doing in here, so that each one of these is gonna be a separate kind of set of studs and top and bottom plates. Kind of like if you're looking at this from the front view, there's the top plate here, the bottom plate here, and then the stud is right here, is actually right here on the piece of paper.
Wish you weren't so f***ing awkward, bud.
Now, it's a really standard construction thing to put your studs every 16 inches. So like you'll hear people when they're talking about construction doing something like 16 on center. That just means the center of each stud is 16 inches from the previous stud. And so I'm gonna need to have those going like pretty much all the way through here. Now, as I'm figuring this out, I'm realizing I gotta do some math here to determine how many studs and how much lumber I'm gonna need. And so, shoot, I got 2x4s that are 12. And then that's 8 feet, and that's 12 feet, but then it's 16 inches, 16 divided by, but then it's 16 inches, but then 16 divided by 2x4s that are 16 inches, 16 divided by 12. I really try to avoid doing math in public. I think I'm gonna need to cheat here. Okay, robot, I need some help from you. I wanna design a new brooder to go inside of my barn. And so I need to frame out a new room that's gonna be 8 feet by 12 feet, and it's gonna be about 8 feet tall. Can you figure out for me how much lumber I'm gonna need to be able to do this? Specifically, I also need to have a standard sized door that is placed on one of the 12-foot walls.
Sure, I can help you with that.
She can
to
help.
calculate the lumber needed, we'll consider the frame for the walls, the door frame, and any additional supports you might need. Typically, wall studs are placed 16 inches or 1.33 feet apart.
Okay, that sounds great. Can you give me a detailed breakdown of how much lumber I need to buy at the building supply store? We are living in the future. Holy smokes, it's producing a detailed breakdown. This is crazy. I didn't think this was gonna work, but the idea that I could just tell my phone what I wanna do and it's gonna give me a breakdown like this, that's pretty nuts.
To accommodate your project with 12-foot length 2x4s, you'll need to purchase about 18 pieces. This calculation ensures that you have enough lumber for both the studs and the top and bottom plates, considering the adjustments for the door frame and the efficiency of using longer lumber lengths. It's always a good idea to buy a little extra to account for any mistakes or adjustments you might need to make during construction.
Can you also give me a diagram for what I actually need to build?
Here's the diagram for the brooder room you're planning to build. It shows the layout of the room.
This is crazy. This is like a whole diagram, and even though it has chickens that are a little too old and it drew a window for some reason, that's actually pretty useful. Of course, the text on it looks like garbage, but other than that, wow. It's crazy how we're living in the future. So now I guess I just need to go to the building supply store, huh?
Yes. Building this brooder room sounds like an exciting project.
Thanks, computer. That was really helpful.
I'm glad I could help.
So now that I know how much lumber I'm gonna need to build my little hatchery, I decided to head off to the building supply store to get said building supplies. I'm probably not gonna try to get everything all at once, but I'm gonna get the 2x4s I need to do all the framing for today. I gotta admit, I hate having to pick out lumber at the big box stores. There's so many junk pieces of 2x4s or whatever you're buying at any given moment that you have to be really careful and look really closely to see if there's cracks or there's chips or if there's like significant warping or bending to the boards. Like, it's just a problem over and over and over again. I used to put my orders in online and they would pre-pack everything and all I'd have to do is pick it up. But I would find that I would get the worst pieces of lumber every time I do that. And so now I have to pick out every piece I buy by hand. Anytime I'm buying 2x4s, I always buy one more than I actually need because I know I'm always gonna need it. With the truck all loaded up and my load securely ratchet strapped down, it's time to head back to the farm and start cutting.
Hey there, birds. How's it going, guys? So this greenhouse is where all of my birds live for the winter months. In the warmer months, they will free range out in pasture, but because it's winter in Vermont, they stay indoors right now. Of course, they can go outside if they want to, but on days like today, they probably don't want to. With the help of my buddy Alfred, I actually built this entire greenhouse, which if you'd asked me 10 years ago if I'd be able to build a greenhouse, I would think that would be entirely unthinkable. I mean, the real truth of the matter is I used to be the type of person who had to pay people to build his IKEA furniture. And I'm very serious about that. Like, I was just very inept because I always grew up in a household where I wasn't taught how to use tools or build things and like kind of all that sort of stuff. And that by no means is meant as like a knock against my parents or anything. It's just not something I learned how to do. And so by the time I was in my 20s and 30s, I was very uncomfortable with the idea of power tools. And I just didn't have a really good sense of the physical world and how things fit together and work together. And it really wasn't until I actually moved out to this farm that I actually started to build up some of those skills. And so oftentimes when it comes to construction type stuff, you can often feel intimidated. And I remember when I first started, I felt very intimidated too. And so if anybody's gonna take any sort of value whatsoever by watching these videos, my hope is that they too realize that they can start building stuff too, and they don't need to be intimidated. And perhaps through the combination of maybe asking for some help from a friend as well as watching some YouTube videos, you're gonna be able to accomplish a whole heck of a lot. So the first step I have to do is I have to cut the studs and the plates to make the walls. And I'm starting with the long 12-foot wall that's gonna be in the front. Like I said earlier, there's gonna be about 16 inches between each of the studs. The studs basically give the vertical strength for the wall and become the substance of what the wall is. To keep the room warm, I'm gonna be putting insulation in between the studs as well. And so having it be consistent widths will make my life easier when it comes time to add the insulation. I'm using a chop saw or a miter saw to do all these cuts.
What the hell are you talking about?
If you ever hear anybody using those sorts of terms, don't ever be intimidated by it. You know, basically the chop saw or miter saw, you press this button and it fires up, and then you push it down, and that's what's gonna basically chop and cut the wood that you're using. What's really great about these saws is you can always make your cut perfectly straight, or if you look down here, you can actually see where you can change the angle of your cut. So for example, if you wanted to join two 45-degree angles to make a corner, you can actually just adjust the angle on the saw, and then your cut's gonna be on that angle. This is a really handy tool to use, but it's not necessary. If you're just starting out, the other thing you can use is actually just a regular old circular saw, and you can use this saw just to make the cuts. Generally speaking, the blade on this saw is actually very similar to the blade on this saw. The only big difference is that it's slightly bigger on here, and then it's fixed on this angle, so that's how it works. I've been using it for my cuts today just because it makes my work go way quicker versus this, but you can easily do all the cuts you're seeing me do with this. And so if I just had to have one saw, it would be this one. And by the way, at this day and age, don't bother buying the electric ones. You should buy the battery-powered ones. It's just so much more convenient than having to plug stuff into a wall. There have been so many building projects I've had to do where I'd either have to figure out how to get power out to that project, or I'd have to cut stuff like down around here and then bring it like all the way back there. Which is why after just a couple of projects, this battery-powered one is gonna pay for itself. But now with my cuts complete, it's time to head upstairs and start assembling my wall. This is the part where it usually gets kind of fun. Hey Pablo, you gonna help me out? So I find it's always easier to assemble the wall first and then tip it up and then put it in place versus like trying to build it in place, because there's gonna be certain ways that you need to screw different pieces together. And to make like a connection like this when the piece of wood isn't free floating is virtually impossible. But I am gonna start putting things in place just to make sure I've got my sizings all correct and I haven't screwed anything up. Because I've definitely found that that expression of measure twice and cut once absolutely stands true when you're doing work like this. And also, like I said, we're gonna actually start with this wall over here, so this outer wall first. But despite the fact that I wanna try to build up, I also wanna make sure everything stays perfectly square, meaning that all of my walls and joints meet at a perfect right angle. Now, even though I said I'm gonna assemble the stud walls by having them loose first before tacking them down, because I'm starting with the other wall, I'm just gonna temporarily tack this board down. That way I can keep my whole build completely square when I build out that first wall, and it makes sure that this one perfectly connects. I'll have to take this one up later, but for now, this is just for rough placement. So now that I have at least the bottom part of the base plate all set, I gotta do the top plate now. Now, one trick I've found to keeping this top plate square is make sure everything perfectly aligns. What I'll usually do is drop this plate down, and I'll tackle putting in one side just to make sure everything's nice and square. Always use 2 screws. And then I'll come over here to the other side, and I'll make sure this one squares up. You can even see there's a little bit of twist to this top plate, but it's okay, we're gonna straighten it out. Now, the way I'm gonna make all these other ones show up as square, all I gotta do is take my framing square here, pull this to the point where it actually squares up, just like that, boom. I just set that with a couple of screws. Now we got a stud in place. And now all I have to do is just go right on down the line and square all those up. I think I might have run into a little problem here, and I'm pretty sure the computer is to blame. The measurements you gave me are completely wrong. What should I do about this?
I'm sorry to hear that the measurements weren't accurate. Could you tell me which measurements you're referring to?
I'm talking about the space that I needed for the door. It was supposed to be a 28-inch opening so that I could put a door on this incubator room.
Sorry, I'm having issues right now. Our systems are experiencing heavy load. Please try again later.
Well, that's not good. I guess it goes to show you should never trust a computer. But as it stands right now, I'm actually short one stud, and the measurements that I had for this side are different than this side.